Le Mans, Grand Prix, Bathurst, the Indy 500. Car races are big business around the world, but there was a time when people believed these new horseless carriages were a novelty item for the rich, too flimsy for robust activity. In 1908, a race was organized to prove otherwise, in which 6 teams of drivers tried to be the first to get from New York to Paris. Considering the state of automobile technology and the lack of road infrastructure at the time, that was no mean feat. Only 3 of the 6 competitors would even complete the course. The race was a 169-day ordeal, still the longest motorsport event ever held. The starting line was in Times Square on a gray February morning. The 6 driving teams competed under 4 flags: Germany, France, Italy, and the United States, with 3 of the teams being French. The event brought almost 250,000 people to the streets of New York City to witness the start of the race, considerably larger than the crowd for the very first New Year's Eve ball drop earlier that year. The starter's gun fired at 11:15 a.m., 15 minutes late. Mayor George McClellan was supposed to fire the pistol, but he wasn't there on time, and apparently an impatient bystander did the job, and the racers took off. This was the first of many unexpected challenges. The planned route would take the racers across the United States, north into Canada, to Alaska, over the frozen Bering Strait to Siberia, across Russia to Europe, and finally to Paris. The decision to have the race rolling in the midst of winter added to the challenges. Drivers needed to stop often to repair their cars. They even used locomotive lines when it was impossible to find a road. Not the rails, though. The American car straddled the rails, bumping along on the ties for hundreds of miles. The Italian team complained that was cheating. The car that would win had a 4-cylinder, 60-horsepower engine and a top speed of 60 miles per hour. Cars of the day offered little in the way of rider comfort or amenities like a roof or a windshield. They drove around the world, 15 hours a day, in winter, in open-topped cars without windshields. Antifreeze hadn't even been invented yet, so the radiators had to be drained each night to prevent them from freezing. While most teams were made of a driver and a mechanic, some teams included journalists and even a poet instead. The first car, a French César Nodine, dropped out after only 96 miles with a broken differential they couldn't repair. Another French team lost a man after the 2 became stuck in the snow and began to fight. They were about to duel with pistols when the driver fired his assistant, an Arctic travel expert he would need later on. Not even to Iowa yet, the Italian car had mechanical troubles, and the driver tried to cheat by loading the car onto a freight train. He abandoned the plan when a photographer caught him in the act. The car's owner sent him a telegram. "Quit race, sell car, come home." The American team, driving a Thomas Flyer, took the lead across the United States. They managed to arrive in San Francisco in 41 days, 8 hours, and 50 minutes, 9,000 miles ahead of the car in second place. This was actually the very first crossing of the U.S. in an automobile in the winter. The route was then to take the drivers to Valdez, Alaska by ship. The American driver wasted no time investigating the Valdez-Fairbanks Trail in a single-horse sleigh, concluding that the only way to cross Alaska in a car would be to dismantle it and ship the parts by dog sled. The race committee, headquartered in Paris, abandoned the idea of Alaska and the Bering Strait and ordered the Americans to return to Seattle. The new plan was for the cars to sail to Vladivostok and drive to Paris from there. While the Americans were still sailing back to Seattle, their competitors arrived there and set sail for Russia. Then the Americans lost more time getting their Russian visas. The Flyer had been the first to arrive on the Pacific coast, but now was the last to leave, a week behind the competitors. The race committee decided the American team was to be given an allowance of 15 days, meaning the remaining teams could beat them to Paris by 2 weeks and still lose. and they penalized the team that had tried to send their car by train. The driving resumed from Vladivostok, but by that point there were only 3 competitors left. The drivers agreed to start again evenly matched. They had extreme trouble finding petrol in Siberia, leading the French driver to try to bribe the other teams to let him ride on one of their cars so he could at least be on a winning car. This prompted his sponsor to pull him from the race. The 2 teams faced another set of challenges, trying to traverse the tundra of Siberia and Manchuria. The spring thaw turned the Asian plains into seemingly endless swamp. Progress was measured in feet per hour, not miles. Drivers had to push their cars as much as drive them, and even resorted to hitching them up to teams of rented horses. And they got lost. A lot. The racers couldn't ask locals for directions, as none of them spoke Russian, and a wrong turn could cost you 15 hours or more. Once they neared Europe, roads improved, and the race sped up. The Germans arrived in Paris on July 26th, while the Americans were still in Berlin. But the 15-day allowance for the Americans, and the 15-day penalty for the Germans, meant that the flyer had a month to drive to the neighboring country. The American team arrived in Paris 4 days later to win the race, having covered approximately 16,700 miles. Even though the victor had been declared, the Italians drove on and made it to Paris in September. The victory meant huge recognition for the American driver, who in 2010 was also inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. If you're ever in Reno, Nevada, you can see the Thomas Flyer in the National Automobile Museum.